Chapter 9. By late evening, the happy tune I'd been whistling was forgotten. My back throbbed like a stone bruise, and the muscles in my legs and arms started quivering and jerking. I couldn't gulp enough air to cool the burning heat in my lungs, and my strength was gone, and I could go no further. I sat down and called my dogs to me. With tears in my eyes, I told them I just couldn't cut that big tree down. I was trying hard to make them understand when I heard someone coming. It was Grandpa in his buggy. I'm sure no one in the world can understand a young boy like his grandfather can. He drove up with a twinkle in his eye and a smile on his whiskery old face. "Howdy, how are you getting along, boy?" he boomed. "Not so good, Grandpa. I don't think I can cut it down. It's just too big. I guess I'll have to just give up." "Give up?" Grandpa barked. "Now I don't want to hear you say a thing like that. No, sir, that's the last thing I want to hear. Don't ever start anything that you can't finish." "I don't want to give up, Grandpa, but it's just too big and my strength's gone. I'm giving out." "Well, of course you are. You've been doing it wrong. To work like that, a fella needs proper rest and food in his stomach." "And where am I going to get that, Grandpa? I can't leave the tree, and if I do, the coon will go away." "Oh, no, he won't. That's what I came down here for. I'll show you how to keep that coon in a tree." He walked around the big sycamore and looked up and whistled. "Boy, that's a big one, ain't it?" "It sure is, Grandpa. It's the biggest one in the river bottom." Grandpa started chuckling. "That's all right. The bigger they are, the harder they fall." "Well, how are we going to keep the coon to stay up in that tree, Grandpa?" With a proud look in his face, he said, "Well, that's another one of my coon hunting tricks. I learned it when I was a boy. We'd keep him there all right. Oh, I don't mean we'd keep him there for always, but he'd stay for 4 or 5 days. That is, until he gets so hungry that he just has to come down." "Well, I don't need that much time. I'm pretty sure I can get it down by tomorrow night." Grandpa looked at the cut. "I don't know. Even though it's halfways down, you must remember you've been cutting on her half of one night and one day. You might make it, but it's going to take a lot of chopping." "Well, if I can get a good night's sleep and a couple meals under my belt, I can do a lot more chopping yet." Grandpa laughed. "Speaking of meals, your ma is having chicken and dumplings for supper. Now we don't want to miss that, so let's get busy." "What do you want me to do, Grandpa?" "Well, let's see. First, we'll need some sticks about 5 foot long. You take your axe and go over to that cane break over yonder and get us 6 of them." I hurried to do what Grandpa wanted, all the time wondering what in the world he was going to be doing. How could he keep the coon in the tree? When I came back, he was taking some old cloth from the buggy. "Take this stocking cap and fill her about half full of grass and leaves." And while I was doing this, Grandpa walked over and started looking up the tree. "You're pretty sure he's not holler limb, aren't you?" he asked. "He's there all right, Grandpa. There's no other place he could be. I've looked all over it, and there's no other hollow anywhere." "Well, in that case, we better get our man along about here." "What man, Grandpa?" I asked in surprise. "Well, the one we're going to be making. It's to make us a scarecrow, but that coon, it'll think it's a man." Knowing too well how smart coons were, right away I began to lose confidence. "I don't see how anything like that would keep a coon in the tree." "Oh, it'll keep him there, all right. Like I told you before, they're curious little devils. He'll poke his head out of that hole and see that man standing there, and he won't dare come down. It'll take him 4 or 5 days to figure it isn't a real honest-to-goodness man. And by that time, it'll be too late. You'll have his hide tacked on that smokehouse wall, I bet you." The more I thought about it, the more I believed it, and then there was that serious look on Grandpa's face. And that was all it took. I was firmly convinced. I started laughing. The more I thought about it, the funnier it got, and great big laughing tears rolled down my cheeks. What's so funny? Don't you believe it's going to work? Sure it'll work, Grandpa. I know it will. I'm just thinking, those coons aren't half as smart as they think they are they? Well, we both had us a good laugh at this. With the sticks and some baling wire, Grandpa made a frame that looked almost like a gingerbread man, and on this he put an old pair of pants and a red sweater. We stuffed the loose flabby clothes with grass and leaves, and he wired the stocking cap in place and then stepped back to inspect his work. Well, what you think of that? Well, if it had a face, you couldn't even tell it from a real man. Yeah, we'll fix that, Grandpa chuckled. He took a stick and dug some black grease from one of the hubcaps on the buggy. I stood and watched while he applied his artistic touch. In the stocking cap head he made two mean-looking eyes and a crooked nose and the ugliest mouth I ever did see. Well, what you think of that? Looked pretty good, don't it? Laughing fit to kill, talking at all the same time, I told him I wouldn't blame the coon if he stayed in the tree until Gabriel blew his horn. Oh, he won't stay that long, but he'll stay long enough for you to cut that tree down. Well, that's all I want, I said. Well, we better get going. It's getting late and we don't want to miss that supper. I was so stiff and sore he had to help me into the buggy seat. I called my dogs, and little Ann came, but not willingly. Old Dan refused to leave the tree. Come on, boy. Let's go home and get something to eat. We'll be back tomorrow. He bowed his head and looked the other way. Come on. We can't sit here all night. Well, this kind of hurt his feelings. He walked around behind the big sycamore and hid. Well, I'll be darned, Grandpa said as he jumped down from the buggy. He knows that coon's there, and he don't want to leave it. You got a coon hound there, and I mean a good one. He picked old Dan up in his arms and set him into the buggy. All the way home I had to hold on to his collar to keep him from jumping out and going back to the tree. As our buggy wound its way up through the bottoms, Grandpa started talking. You know, Billy, about this tree chopping of yours, I think it's all right. In fact, I think it'd be a good thing if all young boys had to cut down a big tree like that once in their lives. It does something deep inside 'em. It gives 'em determination and some willpower. That's a good thing for a man to have. It goes a long ways in his life. The American people have a lot of her. They have proved that all down through history, but they could do with a lot more of it too. I couldn't see this determination and willpower that Grandpa was talking about very clearly. All I could see was a big old sycamore tree, a lot of chopping, and the hide of a ringtail coon that I was determined to have. As we reached the house, Ma came out. Right away she started checking me over. Are you all right? She asked. Sure, Ma. What makes you think something's wrong with me? Well, I don't know. The way you acted when you got down from the buggy, I thought maybe you was hurt. Oh, he's just a little stiff and sore from all that chopping, but he'll be all right. That'll go away soon. After Ma saw that there were no broken bones or legs chopped off, she smiled and said, I never know anymore. I guess I'll just have to get used to this. Pa hollered from the porch. Come on in. We've been waiting on supper for you. We're having chicken and dumplings, and I cooked them especially for you. During the meal, I told Grandpa I didn't think that coon in the big tree was the same one my dogs had been trailing at first. Well, what makes you think that? I told how the coon had fooled us and how little Ann had seen or heard this other coon. I figured he'd just walked up on my dogs before he realized it. A smile spread all over Grandpa's face, and chuckling he said, It does look that way, but it wasn't. No, Billy, that would be the same coon. They're much too smart to ever walk up on a hound like that. He pulled a trick, and it was a good one. In fact, it'll fool 9 out of 10 dogs. Well, what'd he do, Grandpa? I'm pretty sure he didn't cross the river, so how'd he work it? Grandpa pushed the dishes back, and using his fork as a pencil, he drew an imaginary line on the tablecloth. It's called the backtracking trick, he said. And here's how he worked it. He climbed that water oak tree, and he only went up about 15-20 feet, then turned around and came back down on his own tracks. He backtracked on his original trail for a ways, and when he heard your dogs a-comin', he leapt far up into the side of the nearest tree and climbed up. He was in that tree all the time your dogs were searching for the lost trail. After things seemed to have quieted down, he figured they'd given up, and that's when he came back down, and that's when little Ann either heard or saw him. Pointing the fork at me, Grandpa said very serious, "You mark my words, Billy. In no time at all, that little Ann, she'll know every trick a coon can pull. You know, Grandpa, she wouldn't bark treed at that water oak like old Dan did." "Of course she wouldn't. She knew he wasn't in there."
"Why, I never heard of such a thing. I'd no idea coons were that smart. Why, for all anyone knows, he may not have been in the big tree at all. Maybe he pulled another trick. It'd be a shame if Billy cut it down and found there was no coon in it."
"Oh, he's there, Ma. I know he is. They were right on his tail when he went up it. Besides, little Ann was bawling her head off when I came to them." "Oh, of course he's there. They was crowding him too closely. He didn't have no time to pull another trick." Grandpa left soon after supper and saying to me, "I'll be back here in a few days, and I want to see that coon hide." Well, I thanked him for helping me and walked out to the buggy with him. "Oh, I almost forgot," he said. "I heard there's a fad back in New England states. It seems like everyone's crazy about coonskin coats. Now, if this is true, I look for the price of coon hides to take a jump." Well, I was happy to hear this, and I told my father what Grandpa had said. Pa laughed and said, "Well, if you can keep the coons out of them big sycamores, you might just make a little money." Before I went to bed, Ma made me take a hot bath, and then she rubbed me all over with some liniment that burned like fire and smelled like Civet's cat. It seemed like I had barely closed my eyes when Ma woke me.
"Breakfast is ready, Billy."
Well, I was so stiff and sore I had trouble putting my clothes on. Ma helped me.
"Maybe you better let that coon go. I don't think he's worth all of this."
"I can't do that, Ma. I've gone too far now." Pa came in from the barn. "What's the matter? You a little stiff?"
"A little stiff? Why, he could hardly put his clothes on."
"Oh, he'll be all right. If I know anything about swinging an axe, it won't be long before he's as limber as a rag." Ma just shook her head and started putting our breakfast on the table. And while we were eating, Pa said, "You know, I woke up several times last night, and each time I was sure I could hear a hound bawling. It sounded like old Dan." Well, I quit that table on the run and headed for the doghouse. I didn't have to go all the way. Little Ann met me on the porch, and I asked her where old Dan was and called his name. He was nowhere around. Little Ann started acting strangely. She whined and stared towards the river bottom, and she ran out the gate and came back and reared up at me. Ma and Pa came out on the porch.
"He's not here. I think he's gone back to the tree." "I don't think he'd do that, would he? Maybe he's around someplace. Have you checked in the doghouse?"
I ran and looked, and he wasn't there.
"Everyone be real quiet and listen,"
I said. I walked out beyond the gate a little ways and whooped as loud as I could. My voice rang like a bell in the still, frosty morning, and before the echo had died out, the deep "Arrrr" of old Dan howled and rolled out of the river bottoms.
"He's there. He wanted to make sure that coon stayed in that tree. You see, Ma, why I have to get that coon. I just can't let him down." "Well, I never in all my life. I had no idea a dog loved to hunt that much. Yes, Billy, I can see it now, and I want you to get him. I don't care if you have to cut down every tree in those bottoms. I want you to get that coon for those dogs."
"I'm going to get him, Ma, and I'm going to get him today if I possibly can." Pa laughed and said,
Well, looks like there wasn't any use in building that scarecrow. All you had to do was tell old Dan to stay and watch that tree. Well, I left the house in a run. Now and then I would stop and whoop, and every time I was answered by that deep voice of old Dan. Little Ann ran ahead of me. By the time I reached the big tree, their voices were making the bottoms ring. When I came tearing up out of the underbrush, old Dan threw a fit. He tried to climb the sycamore. He would back way off, and then, bawling and running as fast as he could, he'd claw his way far up on the side. Old Ann, not to be outdone, reared up and placed her small front paws on the smooth white bark. And she told that ringtail coon that she knew that he was there. After they quieted down, I called old Dan to me. I'm proud of you, boy. It takes a good dog to stay with a tree all night, but there wasn't any need in you coming back. The coon wouldn't have gotten away. That's why we built the scarecrow. Little Ann came over and started rolling in the leaves. The way I was feeling towards her, I couldn't even smile at her playful mood. Of course you feel good, I said in an aggravated voice. And it's no wonder you had a good night's sleep in the nice warm doghouse, but old Dan didn't. He was down here in the cold all by himself watching the tree. The way you're acting, I don't believe you care if the coon gets away or not. I would have said more, but just then I noticed something. I walked over for a better look. There, scratched deep in the soft leaves, were two little beds. One is smaller than the other. Looking at little Ann, I read the answer in her warm gray eyes. Old Dan hadn't been alone when he had gone back to that tree. She, too, had gone along, and there was no doubt that in the early morning she came back home to get me. There was a lump in my throat as I said, I'm sorry, little girl. I should have known. The first half hour was torture. At each swing of the axe, my arms felt like they were being torn from their sockets. Well, I grit my teeth and I kept hacking away. My body felt like the time my sisters rolled me down the hill in a barrel. As Pa had said, in a little while the warm heat from the hard work limbered me up. I remember what my father did when he was swinging an axe. At the completion of each swing, he'd say, "Ha!" I tried it, and kerwham, ha! Kerwham, ha! I don't know if it helped or not, but I was willing to try anything if it would hurry up that job. Several times before noon I had to stop and rake the chips out of the way. I noticed they weren't the big, even, solid chops like my father made when he was chopping. They were smaller and seemed to crumble and come all up in pieces. Neither were the cuts neat and even. They were ragged and looked more like a work of a beaver. But I wasn't interested in any beautiful tree chop, and all I wanted was to hear that big sycamore start popping. Along in the middle of the afternoon, I felt a sting in one of my hands. When I saw it was a blister, I almost cried. At first there was only one, and then two. One after another they rose up on my hands like small white marbles. They filled up and turned a pale pinkish color, and when one would burst, it was all I could do to keep from screaming. I tore my handkerchief in half and wrapped my hands. This helped for a while, but when the cloth began to stick to the raw flesh, I knew it was the end. Crying my heart out, I called my dogs over to me and showed them my hands. I can't do it, I said. I've tried, but I just can't cut it down. I can't even hold the axe any longer. Little Ann whined and started licking my sore hands, and old Dan seemed to understand. He showed his sympathy by nuzzling me with his head. Broken-hearted, I started for home. As I turned, and from the corner of my eye, I saw Grandpa Scarecrow, what seemed to be laughing at me. I looked over at the big sycamore. It lacked so little being cut down. A small wedge of wood was all that was holding it up. I let my eyes follow the smooth white trunk up to the huge spreading limbs. And sobbing, I said, You think you have won, but you haven't. Although I can't get that coon, neither can you live because I've cut off all your breath of life. And then I thought, why kill the big tree and not accomplish anything? And then I began to feel bad. Kneeling down betwixt my dogs, I cried and prayed. Please, God, give me the strength to finish this job. I don't want to leave the big tree like that. Help me finish. I was trying to rewrap my hands so I could go back to work when I heard the low, droning sound. I stood up and looked around. I could still hear the noise, but couldn't locate it. I looked up, and high in the top of the big sycamore, a breeze had started the limbs to swaying. A shudder ran through the huge trunk. I looked over to my right at the big black gum tree, and not one limb was moving. On its branches, a few dead leaves hung silent and still. One dropped and floated lazily towards the ground. On my left stood a large hackberry. I looked up at its top, and it was still as a fence post. Another gust of wind caught the top of the big tree. It started popping and snapping. I knew it was going to fall. Well, I grabbed my dogs by the collars and I backed off to safety. I held my breath. The top of the big sycamore rocked and swayed. There was a loud crack that seemed to come from deep inside that heavy trunk. Fascinated, I stood and watched the giant of the bottoms. It seemed to be fighting so hard to stand. Several times I thought it would fall, but in a miraculous way it would pull itself back into perfect balance. The wind itself seemed to become angry at the big tree's stubborn resistance. It growled and moaned as it pushed harder against the quivering top. With one final grinding, creaking sigh, the big sycamore started down. It picked up the momentum as the huge weight of the overbalanced top drove for the ground. A small ash was smothered by its huge bulk, and there was a lightning-like crack as the trunk snapped. In its downward plunge, the huge limbs stripped the branches from the smaller trees. A log-sized one knifed through the top of the water oak. Splintering limbs flew skyward and rained down around the bottoms. With a cyclone roar, the big tree crashed to the ground, and then silence settled over the bottom. Out of the broken, twisted, tangled mess streaked a brown, furry ball. I turned my dogs loose and started screaming at the top of my lungs, "Get 'em, Dan! Get 'em!" In his eagerness, old Dan ran head-on into a bur oak tree, and he sat down and with his big, deep voice told the river bottoms that he'd been hurt. It was little Ann who caught the coon. I heard the ringtail squeal when she grabbed him. Scared half to death, I snatched up a club and ran to help her. The coon was all over her. He climbed up on her head, growling and slashing and ripping and tearing. Yelping with pain, she shook him off, and he streaked for the river. Well, I thought surely he was going to get away. At the very edge of the river bank, she caught him again. I was trying hard to get a lick in with my club, but couldn't for fear of hitting little Ann. Through the tears in my eyes, I saw the red, blurry form of old Dan sail into the fight, and he was a mad hound. His anger at the bur oak tree had been taken out on the coon, and we stretched old Ringy out betwixt the two of them and pinned him to the ground. It was savage and brutal. I could hear the dying squeals of the coon and the deep growls of old Dan. In a short time it was all over. With sorrow in my heart, I stood and watched while my dogs worried the lifeless body. Little Ann was satisfied first, and I had to scold old Dan to make him stop. Carrying the coon by a hind leg, I walked back to the big tree with my axe. Before leaving for home, I stood and looked at the fallen sycamore. I should have felt more proud over the job I had done, but for some reason I couldn't. I knew I would miss the giant of the bottoms, for it had played a wonderful part in my life. I thought of the hours I had whiled away staring at his beauty, and how hard it was to find a right name for it. I'm sorry. I didn't want to cut you down, but I had to. I hope you can understand. I was a proud boy as I walked along in the twilight of evening. I felt so good even my sore hands had stopped hurting. What boy wouldn't have been proud? Hadn't my little hounds treed and killed their first coon? Along them I decided that I was a full-fledged coon hunter. Nearing our house,
I saw the whole family had come out onto the porch. My sisters come a-running, stared wide-eyed at the dead coon. Laughing, Pa said, "Well, I see you got him." "I sure did, Pa," I said. I held the coon up for 'em all to see. Ma took one look at the lifeless body and winced. "Billy, when I heard that big tree fall, it scared me half to death. I don't know but what it had fallen on you." "Oh, Ma, I was safe. Why, I backed way off to one side. It couldn't have fallen on me." Ma just shook her head. "I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if all mothers have to go through this." "Come on, Billy. I'll help you skin 'em," Pa said. And while we were tacking the hide on the smokehouse wall, I asked Pa if he had noticed any wind blowing this evening. He thought a bit, said, "No, I don't believe it did. I've been out all day, and I'm pretty sure I didn't notice much wind. Why do you ask?" "Oh, I don't know, Pa, but I thought something strange happened down in those bottoms this afternoon." "I can't say I follow you there, Billy. What do you mean, something strange happened?" I told him how my hands had gotten so sore I couldn't chop any more, and how I had asked for strength to finish the job. "Well, what's so strange about that?" "I don't know, but I didn't chop the big tree down. The wind blew it over." "Why, that's nothing. I've seen that happen a lot of times." "It wasn't just the wind, it was the way it blew. It didn't touch any other tree in the bottoms. I know because I looked around. The big tree was the only one touched by the wind. Do you think God heard my prayer? Do you think He helped me?" Pa looked at the ground and scratched his head. In a sober voice, he said, "I don't know, Billy. I'm afraid I can't answer that. You got to remember the big sycamore was the tallest tree in the bottoms. Maybe it was up there high enough to catch the wind where the others couldn't. No, I'm afraid I can't help you there. That's something you'll have to decide for yourself." Well, it wasn't hard for me to decide. I was firmly convinced that I had been helped. End of chapter 9.